Good evening. From National Public Radio in Washington, I'm Susan Stanford.
And I'm Sanford Unger, with All Things Considered.
If I were a liberal, I'd be a very, very frightened person today, running for office in 1982. So I would encourage the Democratic Party from a pragmatic point of view to move hard right and recognize the fact that they represent absolutely no one except a bunch of the seat intellectuals in the bureaucracy, certain parts of the media, and the very small leadership in the Democratic Party.
The head of the National Conservative Political Action Committee says it's a turning point in American history. On Capitol Hill, someone ripped the nameplate off Birch Bayh's office door. Tonight on All Things Considered, Ronald Reagan and the domino theory of politics.
The voice of the people was clear. Early analysis indicates they were voting against Jimmy Carter, but also for Ronald Reagan.
Big changes in the Senate. Howard Baker of Tennessee will likely become the first Republican majority leader in 26 years.
In the state legislatures, the Republicans also advanced, picking up more than 200 seats.
Which could have profound effects when it comes time to reapportion congressional seats on the basis of the 1980 census.
We analyze the effect of the election on the hostage crisis in Iran.
And learn about Reagan management style on All Things Considered. First, news from Rich Harris.
A mandate for change. That's how the Reagan camp interprets yesterday's landslide victory. President-elect Reagan met with running mate George Bush and other top advisors today to plan their transition to power, which will include a clean sweep of Carter appointees. Replacements, though, won't be named until the end of the month. Looking at Reagan's victory, Chief Strategist Richard Wirthlin says it was a referendum on Jimmy Carter's leadership. Wirthlin believes the hostages were not a factor, but the president's harsh attacks were.
When Carter launched his rather personal and direct confrontive attack on the governor, one of the major consequences of that was that the president lost credibility.
President Carter flew to Camp David today for a week of rest and contemplation after talking with reporters about his drubbing and his future. Roger Gittins reports.
President Carter blames his defeat on a flood of voter frustration. In his words, there are no indications in the polls that there was a turning against me personally. The president gave his assessment to a small group of reporters invited into the Oval Office. Mr. Carter stood by the doorway welcoming each of us with a firm handshake. He looked surprisingly well-rested and composed after the grueling final days of the campaign and its ultimate disappointment. Mr. Carter suggested that events in the last 6 months beyond his control had triggered the landslide. He cited Iran, the Cuban refugees, and inflation as major factors. The president said he plans to work on his memoirs after leaving office, but sidestepped a question about any future political ambitions. He said, "That's a question I haven't even dreamed about." Roger Gittins at the White House.
One of the many factors that worked against the president yesterday was voter apathy. Only 52.3% of Americans eligible to vote went to the polls. That's the lowest voter turnout for a presidential election in 32 years. The Reagan landslide worked to the advantage of Republican candidates for Congress, coattails they call it. The GOP captured 33 House seats, cutting into the Democratic majority, and for the first time in 26 years, the Republicans will control the Senate. One by one, prominent Democratic liberals were defeated. McGovern of South Dakota, Church of Idaho, Magnuson of Washington, Bayh of Indiana, Culver of Iowa, and Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin. Liberal Republican Jacob Javits of New York also lost his seat. Come January, there'll be at least 51, possibly 53 Republicans in the Senate. One Senate contest is still undecided. Arizona's Barry Goldwater is leading in his race for a fifth term, but a ballot shortage yesterday forced the polls to reopen today by court order, and the results aren't in yet. Investors reacted instantly and favorably to the coming Reagan presidency. Wall Street went wild. The Dow Jones Industrial Average soared amid exceptionally heavy trading. NPR's Wendy Kaufman reports.
Investors, both institutions and private individuals, like Governor Reagan's economic policies and his energy program. Some securities analysts, like Lee Carr, trading manager for the New York firm of Morgan Stanley, say Reagan's policies differ substantially from President Carter's.
He's going to try to obviously curb inflation, which has been a serious impact on the investor. He's trying to get the interest rate structure a lot lower. It's a whole economic package geared to both the inflation rate and interest rate situation.
At one point, the Dow Jones was up nearly 30 points before closing about 16 points higher. Trading volume was a near record. 79 million shares were traded. I'm Wendy Kaufman in Washington.
No movement today on release of the hostages in Iran, but Reagan's victory does not appear to be a factor. Iran's prime minister says the election will have no effect on the conditions for the release of the Americans. The spiritual leader of the Iranian militants agrees, but says the crisis may now be prolonged. Among world leaders, Britain's Margaret Thatcher welcomes the Reagan presidency. Sources say the conservative prime minister sent the president-elect a particularly warm message and looked forward to working closely with him. French officials say that change is good, that it ends a period of uncertainty. Other European governments expressed hope that the Reagan presidency will establish close ties with NATO leaders. Egypt's President Sadat congratulated Reagan and praised Jimmy Carter for his peace efforts on behalf of Egypt and Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Begin hopes to meet with Reagan when he visits the U.S. next week. Moscow hasn't said much, but doesn't seem to be entirely displeased. Peking is more cautious. Here's Philip Short.
Now that Mr. Reagan had been elected, China hoped and expected that he'd follow the principles laid down when diplomatic relations were established, so that ties between the two countries would continue to make good progress and grow stronger. In other words, that if Mr. Reagan goes ahead with his campaign promises to restore official relations with Taiwan, America's relationship with China will not be a happy one. The Chinese seem anyway to have doubts about Mr. Reagan's political judgment. He and Mao's widow, Jiang Qing, one official said in private recently, were excellent examples of why actors should stay out of politics. Philip Short, BBC, Peking.
And I'm Richard Harris in Washington.
I was shocked, really.
The landslide was just phenomenal. I just couldn't believe it.
The quickness, that's what really surprised me. But I think people were ready for a change.
Were you surprised by yesterday's landslide victory for Ronald Reagan? And if so, why? It's the question we put to voters today in San Francisco, Chicago, Ames, Iowa, and Boston.
Well, I thought it was going to be closer.
I've never seen anything like this in all the years. Only when I was a kid, when Hoover was in, and...
I've become kind of pessimistic about American politics.
Well, after 4 years of what went on in this country.
I know in California especially, they were on their way to the polls finding out that Carter had already conceded, so a lot of Democrats just stayed home.
Shocked. I was shocked.
I thought it was going to be a lot closer.
Well, I knew Ronald Reagan was going to win. It was predicted that way, and people wanted to change. I knew he was going to win.
Shocked and dismayed might be better adjectives for my reaction to the election.
Yeah, very surprised. Yes, I really expected more from the American voter. Maybe the country's tired of feeling guilty about things like Vietnam.
People didn't think enough about his social policies, and perhaps that's the most scary aspect of this.
I was glad it happened. Most people do want what the Republican Party is standing for, and so I think that's why it was such a landslide.
Well, I think it really surprised me because I never dreamed it would be like this.
The margin of the Reagan victory, the number of Republicans who were swept into office with him, surprised even staunch supporters of Governor Reagan. We asked NPR's Robert Krulwich to help us to explain Reagan's overwhelming success.
One theory is that it was in major part an anti-Carter vote. Reagan was just a means to an end. And the Associated Press did report that in a national sample of Reagan voters, 2/3 said that they voted Republican yesterday because, quote, Carter is doing a bad job as president, unquote. And they mentioned Carter's performance on interest rates, inflation, national defense. But it seems they had a fundamental objection which went beyond the president, though it began with him and his way of dealing with problems, as described here by Chicago professor Eugene Kennedy.
He says we can't do this. We can't do that anymore. Our hands are tied, or this is beyond us.
Always when he comes before us, he makes us believe that inflation is somehow our fault, that we're buying too many things, we're living too high off the hog.
Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption.
The only thing that's been suggested is conservation and higher taxes and prices on what we have. That's not the answer. And we're not to blame.
From the very start, Ronald Reagan conveyed a different mood than President Carter. He was more positive, more exuberant, and it happened naturally, for Reagan seems to be an incurable optimist. Some say he's recklessly optimistic, but the difference worked for him. It struck a strong chord in many voters who found themselves increasingly uneasy with President Jimmy Carter's vision of a future with limits. Here's Alan Ott, a banker in Michigan.
I'm not comfortable with people telling me we have to go to a smaller world, live in smaller houses, pay more for gas. I want my children to have the right to have some of the same opportunities I did. I'm not comfortable in telling me that we can't dream and do most of the things we want to do.
Yeah, you're starting a vicious cycle.
Ernst Dichter is an author who writes about the future.
If you people stop wishing.
Is that what you think that President Carter's subliminal message is when he says we have to
maybe, yeah.
But we've discovered that owning things and consuming things does not satisfy.
In contrast, Ronald Reagan not only promised a more prosperous future filled with more things, he sounds like he believes that it's going to happen, and his confidence, in spite of the practical problems, conveys a sense of strength and leadership, which he underscored by rushing to embrace Franklin D. Roosevelt, cutting Carter off from his party's ancestry so that Carter had to ask for FDR back. And as Reagan well knew, Carter would not come off very well in any comparison with FDR. It was a very subtle move, forcing Democrats to contrast Carter with Roosevelt, and it worked like a charm.
There is very little evoking of the buoyant spirit that took on the Second World War, even the Depression, with confidence that we could emerge from it, helped in no small measure by the confident character of Franklin D. Roosevelt.
In the end, the comparison flattered Ronald Reagan, whose confidence has never been in doubt. And that may bring us to the heart of this election. Jimmy Carter, almost by accident of personality, conveyed to the voters the sense that the New Deal has now reached its limits, that it's time now to fine-tune, scale back, settle down. But the voters weren't ready. They don't believe Carter. They chose to believe Reagan instead.
The country's smart enough that they come up with technology and innovative enough. And quite frankly, that comes right down to the heart of the question. If our gas is being gone, do we roll up and say we're going to change our lifestyle, or are we going to find something different to make this country continue to be as great as it was?
All across this land, I have found that there's a longing for hope, a longing for a belief in ourselves and the vision that gave birth to this nation.
And yesterday, the voters decided to chance it with Reagan, in part because they didn't want Carter, and in part because just maybe Reagan might be on to something. I'm Robert Krulwich in Washington.
Reagan campaign aides held a briefing today in Los Angeles. They were more inclined to look back at what happened last night than to look ahead at what will happen in the weeks to come. NPR's Cokie Roberts was there.
Reagan's pollster, Richard Worthland, held his big black book, Campaign Strategy 1980, under his arm as he explained how the Republicans racked up the huge victory in yesterday's election.
We felt that if this election did come down to the issue of the economic cluster, if people asked themselves whether there was better hope to reduce inflation through a Reagan presidency, that we would win it. And that's exactly what happened in the last 4 or 5 days of this campaign.
Worthland says that the strategy all along had been first to get Reagan known to more voters. The California record ads eventually achieved that end. And then, once the governor's credibility was established, to go on the attack against Jimmy Carter. That happened in the last week of the campaign, when Reagan spent twice as much as Carter on media advertising. Worthland says that Jimmy Carter also helped Ronald Reagan in his efforts by going on the attack too soon and too strong.
We did strategize a Carter campaign, and I don't want to go back over that, but only to say that I believe that the personal attacks on the governor probably did as much to help us reach our objectives as any other thing that the Carter campaign did. We saw the opportunity for a role reversal. That is, by the end of the campaign, I think we came very close to having people look upon Ronald Reagan as more presidential than Jimmy Carter. And to some extent, that was due to the kind of personal campaign that Carter launched relatively early.
Worthland's numbers show that Reagan's strength kept building from the middle of October on and grew fairly steadily after the debate. And he insists that the hostage issue had no effect on the outcome of the election. Reagan forces believe they did very well with all their target groups, including Catholics, Hispanics, and Jews. The most crucial group to win over was women, since early polls showed Ronald Reagan trailing by 10 points among women. The campaign sent busloads of prominent Republican women on the road, as well as running ads where Betty Ford called for Reagan's election. Women eventually came into the Reagan column in equal proportion to men, and strategists here say that was the biggest single factor in the Reagan landslide. Looking ahead, campaign advisor Ed Meese says that Reagan won't be announcing any cabinet appointments until the end of the month, but that the president-elect is likely to tell us more about the staff tomorrow. Later, the campaign director confirmed that Foreign Policy Advisor Richard Allen would be reunited with the Reagan staff. Allen was forced to leave in the closing days of the campaign over reports of his Japanese connections. As for current agency heads and cabinet members, Ed Meese had this to say.
Out of a humanitarian concern for all the time and effort they've put in recently, we think the only decent thing to do is to allow them a well-deserved rest.
President-elect Ronald Reagan and his Vice President-elect George Bush are meeting today at Reagan's home in Pacific Palisades. The two men will hold a joint news conference tomorrow. In Los Angeles, I'm Cokie Roberts.
Of course, all of this gives the political analysts grist for their mills, true grist, that will last for quite some time. Among those milling and mulling, our own Linda Wertheimer.
Well, I think that the thing that we don't know right now is whether we are looking at an affirmation of a new kind of politics, a new set of policies, those endorsed by Governor Reagan and the sorts of Republican candidates that have been elected in the Congress, or whether we are looking at a rejection of the failed policies of President Carter. It's really too soon to tell, and it may not even be possible to tell until we go through another round of elections and see whether the American electorate wants to correct for something that they've done. But whatever the electorate intended by it, and as I say, I don't know, I can't tell, I think it will have that effect.
The word mandate comes to mind at moments like these. Is this a mandate, and if so, for what?
I think that the Republican Party and Governor Reagan would be well within their rights to consider it a mandate.
Yeah.
And it certainly does give them the mechanical possibilities of trying some things. I have thought, during the course of covering Governor Reagan, that he was proposing things that were simply pie-in-the-sky ideas. Whether they work or whether they're not didn't much matter because they could never be tested. The Congress would never let him do it.
But now?
This Congress may let him cut taxes 10% a year for 3 years. Like that.
What about the party itself, the shape of the GOP? Has it finally recovered from Watergate?
It's not so finally. I mean, it's 6 years that the Republican Party has risen from the debris of Watergate in a recovery that is really incredible. I think that you have to give tremendous credit, I would, to Senator Bill Brock, who is the chairman of the Republican Party. He has put together a fundraising apparatus and a candidate education apparatus that has worked very, very well at all levels of the party. And even with the fights of having all the candidates, all the Republican candidates that went into the fray at the beginning of this year, they've come out, obviously, in an incredibly healthy situation. They have just done to the Democrats what the Democrats did to them in 1974. I mean, I think it's a party in roaring good health, but there's no reason to believe that the electorate won't turn on them if they can't deliver.
Yes, and this is the point that you made earlier. Well, the next shot at it will be 1982 for certain congressional seats. What could happen there that will make this the blip in the landscape rather than the major change?
Well, it often happens that in non-presidential years, the electorate will draw back from a decision made in a presidential year and go the opposite direction. You see it sometimes in the same election. The electorate will go Republican for national elections, Democratic for local elections, or something like that. I think that 1982 is not a good year for measuring the Senate because once again, the Republican Party was in disarray when the 1982 class was elected, and so as a result, there are 20 Democrats out of the 33 senators up. And about half of them, I think, right now today, I would consider vulnerable in 1982. The House races are somewhat of a similar story. And so we may have to wait until 1984 and another presidential cycle to see it turn, but of course we'd watch it both years.
Thanks very much. NPR's national political correspondent, Linda Wertheimer.
One less well-known but very important victor in last night's election was the National Conservative Political Action Committee, NCPAC. It targeted liberal candidates for defeat in Senate, House, and state elections. And today, NCPAC claims special credit for the overthrow of Senators John Culver of Iowa, Frank Church of Idaho, George McGovern of South Dakota, and Birch Bayh of Indiana, plus help in several other Senate contests, as well as success in 42 of the House races. National Chairman of NCPAC, John Terry Dolan, explains the key to the committee's overwhelming results.
I think our major success was in focusing the discussion on the record of the incumbent, on how he simply did not represent a state.
I suppose it's almost easier to ask you in this case if there were some races that you would have liked to have had an effect in where you didn't.
Yes, you're right. That is easier. Eagleton, I think, was a good example. We started the Eagleton effort late, in June, and quite honestly, I'm convinced that if we had started 30 days earlier and some other minor things, which I won't bore you in details, but we had a couple of minor breaks, I think we would have won that one. There was really very little beyond that I could say that it was really a heartbreaker.
Well, what's your secret? What do you know that others don't that has put you in a position to really have so much influence on this year's election?
Because the American people are on our side. We got involved in states where a clear ideological liberal was representing a fairly conservative state, and where that individual was attempting to deceive people by implying that he was a conservative or simply not talking about his liberal record. And we were fortunate to the degree that we had the money to go out and expose the records of the incumbents.
So you think this amounts to a major change in the structure of the Senate, in the tenor of American politics at the national level?
I think it clearly establishes a conservative mandate for Ronald Reagan to do precisely what he promised to do when he ran in the primaries and in the general election, which is massive defense expenditures to make America number one again militarily, a huge cut in government spending beyond defense, a huge cut in government regulation, a very substantial tax cut along the Kemp-Roth lines, 10% a year for the next 3 years, and a lot of other things which he talked about, because if Ronald Reagan doesn't do it, he'll pay the political price. And I think you'll see an awful lot of conservatives going out there and saying, you promised, you have a moral duty to do it, and we won't support you if you won't do it. Secondarily, I think this whole election signifies some fairly serious problems for the Democratic Party. For the first time in heaven knows how long, their base has been ripped out from underneath them. Urban Catholic Democrats in the Northeast, Irish, Poles, Italians, traditional Democratic voters, Southern white Christian Democrats crossed over in droves. Yesterday, 8 committee chairmen and 9 subcommittee chairmen were defeated in the House of Representatives. Some very, very serious structural problems with the Democratic Party, and unless, I think, they recognize that the leadership of Ted Kennedy and George McGovern has destroyed the base of the Democratic Party, they're going to go the way the Whigs did. So I would encourage the Democratic Party from a pragmatic point of view to move hard right and recognize the fact that they represent absolutely no one except a bunch of the feed intellectuals in the bureaucracy, certain parts of the media, and the very small leadership in the Democratic Party. And lastly, if I were a liberal, I'd be a very, very frightened person today, running for office in 1982.
Why would you be frightened?
Because the trends are so awesome. This trend, if it continues at half the level it was at this year in 1981 and 82, will be very, very foreboding for any liberal who's running for re-election or election, and who has the nerve to admit he's a liberal.
John Terry Dolan is chairman of NCPAC, the National Conservative Political Action Committee.
The National Women's Political Caucus held a news conference in Washington this morning rather than voicing disappointment over President-elect Reagan's. That's the first time I've said that. President-elect Reagan's outspoken opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. These women are planning to redouble their work in the next administration. They say they are ready for the challenge. Jerry Calkins reports.
The National Women's Political Caucus issued their first official statement. Iris Mitgang, NWPC chair, a former resident of California during Reagan's governorship, indicated that she hoped the caucus would be able to work with the president-elect. She said that Reagan had a strong record in supporting equal rights while governor, and that although Reagan's platform did not support the Equal Rights Amendment, she hoped he would fulfill his promises made to representatives of the caucus during his campaign.
Ronald Reagan, the man elected to be the 40th President of the United States, promised to address the needs of women should he win. When he was governor of California, Ronald Reagan supported a long list of legislation that benefited the women of that state. Now, as president, Ronald Reagan will have the opportunity to follow in the footsteps of other Republican presidents who led the way towards equality of all peoples within our great democracy. The National Women's Political Caucus congratulates Ronald Reagan on his victory and urges him to keep in mind the high ideals of equality for all under the United States Constitution. We challenge him to meet his record in California. If President-elect Reagan indeed continues the great tradition of equality for women, initiated by Republicans so many years ago, we at the National Women's Political Caucus will help to achieve those mutual goals.
While losing some of their largest supporters in Congress, NWPC Chair Mitgang stressed the increasing number of women that will be in the next Congress. Comparing the statistics to 1969, when there were 11 women in Congress, she was encouraged that next year there will be 18 women in the House and 2 in the Senate. But that's no guarantee of a liberal posture. For example, Paula Hawkins, Republican Senate victor in Florida, is opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment.
The influence of the conservative movement was obviously very strong, but the overall picture for women still contains many pluses. For the first time in American history, women candidates have been taken seriously by both the electorate and their opponents. In the next session of Congress, feminists will continue to fight for issues important to women. Newly elected representatives such as Lynn Martin from Illinois, Marge Rauchema from New Jersey, and Claudine Schneider from Rhode Island will join those women already in the Congress.
There was a strong sentiment of realism at the press conference, but beyond that, there was a sense that Mitgang clearly expects to continue the work of the National Women's Political Caucus over the next 4 years.
The election is over, and we have to deal with the reality of today and tomorrow. Part of what's happened in the Senate is the end of an era in terms of liberal politics. And whether we're Republicans or Democrats, as feminists, we've certainly been in the liberal column. And I think we need to look at what it's going to be like to be outsiders in more ways than we were simply as women.
For National Public Radio, this is Jerry Calkins in Washington.
This is NPR, National Public Radio.
Good afternoon. At 5:30, the outbound Dan Ryan is heavy between the Eisenhower and Roosevelt. Both the local and express lanes are slow between 43rd and 76th, again at 87th Street. Outbound on the Kennedy, it's slow between the Loop and Damon. The outbound Stevenson is slow between Damon and Central. The Eisenhower slows down at Paulina, stays that way till Sacramento. Slow again between Independence and Manheim, again at Route 83 until you hit Mill Road. Chicago weather, clear and cold tonight with a low of 32 degrees, mostly sunny and warmer tomorrow with a high around 60, partly sunny and mild on Friday. We have 45 degrees right now at the lakefront, 44 at Midway, and 42 official degrees at O'Hare. This is WBEZ, FM 91.5.
You're listening to WBEZ FM. And of course, that means commercial-free award-winning programs 24 hours a day. WBEZ is commercial-free because we have the support of our listeners. If you're a WBEZ listener, why not become a WBEZ member? Simply give us a pledge of $20 or more, and you'll receive our monthly program guide. Call 641-4088. And if you pledge $30, why, we'll send you a WBEZ-inscribed travel coffee mug for your dashboard as a premium bonus. That's the monthly program guide for a pledge of $20, or the guide and the travel coffee mug for $30. Call 641-4088. Public Radio needs your support.
What were the people voting for in yesterday's election? We asked them that question in the second part of All Things Considered. I'm Sanford Unger.
I'm Susan Stanberg. President Carter hurt some congressional Democrats with his early concessions.
On the West Coast, people are furious with early election returns and predictions.
Big Republican gains in the state legislatures, but the Democrats still control more of them.
Also, tax reform initiatives in more than a dozen states.
That and more in the second part of All Things Considered.
I'm afraid that I felt as though we have lost some of our esteem in foreign countries because of some of the bunglings that have happened, especially some of the ways we've handled this hostage situation.
What were you voting for when you went to the polls yesterday? That's our question, posed to citizens in San Francisco, Chicago, Ames, Iowa, and Boston.
I was voting for a change.
I was looking for economy and also a better picture insofar as the people in foreign countries have of us.
I was voting for Reagan, a change in the economy.
I have been reading about Governor Reagan's ability to finesse things and really be able to deal with people because of his popularity and trying to get in there. Now, whether this will make a difference, I don't know.
I was voting for their policy, their platform.
Because of a change.
I was voting for a new administration.
I thought I liked his stance on our military and economics.
Maybe a stronger president than Carter seemed to be.
I suppose a change.
The pocketbook once again.
I voted for a change. I'm one of the people that made the landslide possible.
Whether you pulled a lever on an old gray voting machine or checked a box on a paper ballot or punched holes in the newfangled computer-read cards, what you were saying is apparently clear. Most of you did not want Jimmy Carter in the White House for 4 more years. And that means that many of you who voted for Carter in 1976 didn't vote for him yesterday. Ira Flato reports.
President Carter lost support along political, religious, and economic lines that had supported him in 1976. He even had trouble in support from members of his own party, as Democrats, along with independents and liberals, went over to the Reagan camp. Protestants, Catholics, and Baptists in the South flocked to Reagan's side. Only Jewish voters gave Carter a majority, but there again, one that was only half-hearted. Self-employed businessmen led an economic landslide behind Reagan. While union members continued to support the president, non-union members gave Reagan a whopping majority. The president scored a slight victory among those with less than a high school diploma, but those who went to college and beyond overwhelmingly supported Governor Reagan. The male vote swamped the president too, while female voters gave Reagan the edge despite his views on the Equal Rights Amendment. The only true strong showing for the president came from black voters, whose final totals will be near 85%, close to the 1976 support level. But the black vote could not overcome the incredible loss of support among white voters in the South, who deserted the president by more than 2-1. Rural cities were especially merciless to Carter, who could manage no better than 35 to 40% in small towns and farms. Even John Anderson made such a small dent in the final total that had he decided not to run, polls show that the remaining vote would probably not have helped the president overcome Reagan's enormous lead. Farms and cities, large and small, economic class of voters, white collar and blue, low and middle class, Baptist and Protestant, each one withheld support from the man they had helped send to the White House 4 years ago. This is Ira Flato in New York.
Not only did traditional Democratic voters join the Reagan bandwagon against Jimmy Carter, but Republican victories in congressional races will reduce the Democratic majority in the House and create the first Republican Senate in 26 years. NPR's Alan Berlow and Nina Totenberg have been following the congressional races and the defeat of several prominent members of the 96th Congress.
Susan, this was really the end of an era, the end of the New Deal era, the end of the Vietnam War political babies era. And all you have to do is look at the list of people who lost and think of how their names have become familiar over the years and with which causes, and you know how many eras have ended.
Let's hear.
Birch Bayh in Indiana, John Culver in Iowa, George McGovern in South Dakota, Frank Church in Idaho, Gaylord Nelson in Wisconsin, John Durkin in New Hampshire, Robert Morgan in North Carolina, and the Dean of the United States Senate, Warren Magnuson, in Washington. They're all gone. Warren Magnuson was there in the early days of the New Deal. He was defeated in this election at the age of 75.
So it is the end of the liberal era, the beginning of a Republican conservative era. What's it going to mean that the Republicans now are in control of the Senate?
You know, the Democrats have controlled the Senate for a quarter of a century, so long that after a while it was almost unquestioned that they were the committee chairman. Louisiana Senator Russell Long's name, for example, just seemed to go with the words powerful finance committee chairman. They just went together.
Right.
Well, not anymore. The finance chairman will probably be Bob Dole of Kansas. The Judiciary Committee will no longer be headed by Edward Kennedy. Rather, the new chairman will be South Carolina's conservative Senator Strom Thurmond. The new chairman of the Energy Committee will probably be James McClure of Idaho. He'll be replacing Scoop Jackson. Scoop Jackson, who on numerous occasions has put the oil companies on the griddle. Senator McClure is much more friendly to the energy industry. The new chairman of the Agriculture Committee will probably be Jesse Helms, the ultra-conservative from North Carolina, although Helms could conceivably become chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee.
Tell us how all of this happened in the Senate. Nina, what was the role of the new right in these various races?
Well, the new right, and I guess you would call that certain conservative groups like the National Conservative Political Action Committee, which spent over $1 million to defeat 6 targeted senators, and the 4 principal targets that it set out, it achieved defeat for. There was also right to life groups. This past Sunday, in many of these races, the entire state, all churches were leafleted with anti-abortion material targeted against senators who voted for abortion in some way or other. Then also there's the moral majority and the other elements of the Christian right. So we saw in this election the birth of a certain kind of political power, and since it was very successful this time, at least for the new right, you can be sure that both liberals and conservatives will use it even more in the future.
Alan Berlow, you've been following the various changes in the House. What sorts of changes have there been? As dramatic as the Senate ones that Nina was just spelling out for?
Not as dramatic in terms of names. Republicans, however, did pick up far more seats than anybody expected. They are very close to having a majority in 2 years.
And we might note here, by the way, that not only do the Republicans control the Senate by a bare 2 or 3 votes, but in addition there are a significant number of conservative Southern and Western Democrats who will join conservative Republicans on many of these votes, so the majority is even larger than it appears.
If there was ever any doubt that conservatives control the Congress, there should be no doubt anymore.
So, we have Republicans in control of the Senate. We have a House which has been conservative and is more conservative than ever. So is the coast clear now for President-elect Ronald Reagan in getting his way with the Congress?
I think that when we talk about tax legislation, Ronald Reagan is going to be given an opportunity to attempt to put into action what he's been talking about.
I have one question, though, here, and my question is it Ronald Reagan's coattails that brought people to victory, or is it Jimmy Carter's coattails that dragged them down to defeat?
Well, I think you have to look at Jimmy Carter, and I think part of the proof of that pudding is how Jimmy Carter has dealt with Congress over the years. His relations with Congress have been pitiful, and they are best exemplified by what he did last night, conceding to Ronald Reagan at 9 o'clock Eastern Time, 9:30 Eastern Time, before the polls even closed on the West Coast. And we don't know exactly how many Democrats went down to defeat because of that, but the registrars in San Francisco, in Oregon, in other places said people were just leaving. They didn't bother to vote. And Carter knew that there were Democrats in very, very tight races. He knew that this was going to be a year where coattails could have an effect, and he apparently simply said, I don't care. And that's amazing.
NPR's Alan Berlow and Nina Totenberg.
As Alan Berlow just pointed out, by 5:30 yesterday afternoon, West Coast time, all three commercial television networks had projected a landslide victory for Ronald Reagan. And a few minutes later, there was the sight and the sound of Jimmy Carter at the lectern at the Sheraton Washington Hotel, conceding the election, telling his supporters he could not lie, that it hurt. But the polls hadn't closed yet in California. Voters there had better than 2 hours left to make a choice. Reporter Ellen O'Leary found today that many Californians are angry with Carter for that early concession.
He did a real disservice to people. They have trouble enough getting people to come out to vote, and then to do something like that, it just stifled all their interest in it. It didn't matter whether they voted or not.
California Secretary of State Marge Fong Yu believes the media announcement, coupled with Carter's concession speech, may have cost California 1 million votes.
During the election day, I was canvassing the various 58 counties in California, and I was getting a report from the counties that the turnout was very good. They were projecting up almost a 80%, maybe even an 85% turnout. Then I got reports after 5 o'clock that the people were just dropping off and that there hardly anybody coming in to vote, particularly after around 7 o'clock no one came in to vote.
6 p.m. to 8 p.m. are traditionally the hours of heaviest voting in California, but the ballot box turnoff this year began just as people got off work.
It was the television station that I got home from work at 5:30, and they're predicting who has won.
So how did that affect you?
I didn't go. I didn't vote.
How about you?
Yeah, I thought it was inappropriate, both on the president's part and on the media's part.
Did you turn around and not vote?
No, I voted in the morning. I hadn't voted yet, and I kind of wondered if I should.
Did you?
Yes, I did.
Were you affected by the fact that the president conceded the election before the polls closed here?
Yeah, I decided to give my vote to Anderson so he wouldn't have to get a job and pay his debts.
I felt kind of good in my heart because I voted for Barry Commoner. When I was in there voting, I was thinking, I want to vote for Carter, but I decided not to vote out of fear of Reagan. So I voted right at the time he was conceding, and I found as soon as I got to my driveway what had happened, and I was so glad I voted for Commoner because I didn't feel ripped off.
Election analysts believe that the local issues in California were affected by the low turnout. Many races were closer than usual, with lighter voting on the Democratic side, though the Republican landslide did not hit this state like it did other parts of the nation. California's Secretary of State says she does not want to see an Eastern media blitz on the West Coast again. She suggests that all the polls close at one agreed time nationwide. For National Public Radio in San Francisco, I'm Ellen O'Leary.
Did the Republican tide that swept over Congress reach the lower levels of government? Earl Mackey is executive director of the National Conference of State Legislatures. We asked him to describe election results at the state level.
The Republicans, we estimate, did gain approximately 200 seats in state legislatures around the country. The Republicans also appear to have gained control of 4 new chambers.
Where are they?
The Ohio Senate, the Illinois House, the Montana House, and the Washington House. In addition, 2 chambers now appear to be tied, equal control. That's the Pennsylvania Senate and the Alaska Senate.
Now, were these legislatures that were previously Democratic?
Yes, that's correct.
What happens when they're tied? I guess it depends on the state.
Well, it it does depend on each state. Sometimes they'll effectively have two presiding officers, or sometimes there's agreement that one party will have the presiding officer and the other party may well have the committee chairmanship. So it varies from state to state.
But on the whole, then, the Republicans have also made significant gains at the state level in these state legislatures.
Yes, they've continued the gains which they really began back in 1978. I think it's important to keep in mind that the Democrats have heavily controlled state legislatures in this country for some time, and so that there weren't as many changes in individual houses in terms of taking control, because in most of those houses, the Democrats have substantial control and have the numbers to withstand this kind of landslide at the national level.
I guess I should ask you first to tell us how it breaks down. How many legislatures are now in Republican hands, how many state legislatures, and how many are in Democratic hands?
The Democrats now control both houses in 29 states.
Well, that's still a majority of the states.
And the Republicans control in 13 states. That's both houses.
Yeah.
And the others are divided, with Republicans controlling one chamber and Democrats the other.
Gee, I guess I better ask how that works in most states, since we're going to have that situation on the federal level when the Republicans control one house and the Democrats another.
One thing that it does for sure is means that there has to be a lot more negotiations between the chambers, a lot more of taking into consideration diverse political views and working out accommodations between the two bodies and also with the governors. But it certainly can be done. It's been done in many states, but I think it takes a lot more focus on working out the agreements and working out the political issues than you would have if you were in a legislature with both houses controlled by a single party.
What is the implication of this for things like the Equal Rights Amendment, which is still pending in a number of state legislatures?
I would say that it probably, at first blush, doesn't make for any kind of dramatic change. I think the ERA amendment would still have difficulty in being approved in a number of legislatures, but obviously it's out there and it'll be looked at.
One of the duties of the state legislatures every 10 years is to reapportion the congressional seats if there's been a change in the number of seats that the state has. So in effect, we could say that by winning so many more seats at the state legislative level, the Republicans may be able to increase their number of seats in Congress, in the House, next time around.
Well, it's possible, certainly in those states where they control both houses, and in those states where they've picked up one of the chambers. We appear to show about 4. I think in those states they'll obviously have more influence on congressional reapportionment. The other states where they've just picked up numbers, obviously I think increased numbers will give them increased influence in the legislatures. Although I think you have to keep in mind that the Democrats still control heavily in these state legislatures.
Earl Mackey is executive director of the National Conference of State Legislatures, an organization based in Denver that lobbies on behalf of the country's 7,500 state lawmakers and their staff.
Besides candidates, there were questions and propositions on ballots all across the country yesterday, major tax-related issues in more than a dozen states, and the most successful tax revolt took place in Massachusetts. There, voters overwhelmingly approved a proposition to slash property taxes by 40%. And in Arkansas, a constitutional amendment to block tax increases won by a 4-to-1 margin. But if voters were in a tax-cutting mood, it was not evident in most of the other states, where imitations of California's Proposition 13 were defeated by comfortable margins. In Michigan, there were 3 tax-cutting proposals on the ballot, and the voters rejected all of them. Paul Eisenstein tells why.
2 of the ballot proposals actually would have just shifted the tax burden off property owners. Lost revenue would have been made up through an increase either in the sales or income taxes. But the most controversial of the measures, Proposal D, would have slashed property taxes by 60% and made it hard for the state to compensate with other new levies. At one point, it looked like all 3 proposals could have passed, but apparently several factors added up to their defeat. A political science professor at Wayne State University, Dale Vineyard, notes that all the Michigan ballot issues, some not involving taxes, were voted down yesterday.
I think that in itself is rather interesting. There was this general negative reaction. I think the natural tendency of people may be to vote against something rather than for something, particularly if they don't fully understand it or its implications. And I think that, particularly several of the tax proposals, I think were complicated, and people might not fully understand their implications. I think, particularly in regard to Proposal D, that a fairly well-mobilized campaign against it seems to have paid off. I think a lot of people were concerned that maybe they did want some property tax relief, and maybe they did want some reduction of government, but they thought this might be too drastic a way of going about it.
The opposition to Proposal D covered a wide spectrum, including organized labor, higher education, and the state government. And these forces were led by a very popular figure, Governor William Milliken.
If the decision is in the affirmative, in support of the Tisch proposal, Michigan is in for the most critical and serious times, I think, in its history.
Voters were warned that Proposal D could force schools and parks to close and eliminate many social services, but backers of the measure called these meaningless scare tactics. In the end, it came down to almost a personal battle between the governor and Robert Tisch, a county drain commissioner, and the man who pushed Proposal D onto the ballot.
Michigan is already broke. Michigan is already a catastrophe. Michigan is already a disaster. And to correct that disaster, we need Proposal D to pass.
The governor won, and Tisch appears to be bitter about it, but he's not ready to concede defeat. Tisch led a similar measure onto the ballot 2 years ago, and it lost then by a much wider margin. So he feels the support has actually grown. The mandate is there, he says, for a tax cut, and if the governor and the legislature don't take action, Tisch warns that he may be back. For National Public Radio, I'm Paul Eisenstein in Detroit.
In other ballot initiatives, pro-nuclear forces scored some successes yesterday. In Montana, voters effectively refused to ban uranium mining by a wide margin. Missouri voters gave the go-ahead to build nuclear plants even if dumping sites are not federally licensed. But for anti-nuclear environmentalists, there were big victories. South Dakotans said yes to a measure requiring voter approval of new nuclear power plants, radioactive waste disposal sites, and uranium mines and mills. In Oregon, voters passed a similar initiative, despite significant opposition led by electric power companies. And in Washington state, voters gave overwhelming approval to a proposal that, if upheld in court, will ban the importation of out-of-state, non-medical nuclear waste from July of 1981. Barbara Bernhardt filed this report about what happens next.
Nearly 75% of the state's voters approved Initiative 383, the Don't Waste Washington initiative. According to Ruth Weiner, chairman of the Don't Waste Washington Committee, it's a vote that proves categorically that the people of Washington will not allow the state to become the nation's high and low-level nuclear waste dumping ground. But now that the initiative is passed, it raises a number of issues that will require resolution by or soon after the July 1st deadline. Though the measure exempts medical nuclear waste from the ban, Dr. Will Melp, chairman of the University of Washington's Nuclear Medicine Department, is concerned over the continued availability of radioactive isotopes for research and treatment from out-of-state companies.
There is some question and considerable uncertainty if the people who are our manufacturers, who are our right arms, if they will be able to appropriately discharge their waste here. And if they are not, then we're all seriously involved.
Initiative 383 permits continued disposal of nuclear waste generated in-state at the Hanford site in eastern Washington. But many representatives of Washington state industry feel the measure may nevertheless have a serious impact on the state's jobs and businesses. Joanne Bueller is a member of the Committee for a Sensible Energy Policy, one of the groups that opposed Initiative 383.
Boeing is a very good example, is that they get parts exclusively from a company called Precision Cast Company in Oregon. Precision Cast Company uses radionuclides in the production of the parts for the Boeing jets. And if they can't get rid of their waste, they can't produce the parts. And if they can't produce the parts, Boeing can't get the parts for the planes, and that impacts Boeing and the jobs in this state.
The initiative does allow Washington to form interstate compacts to enable states in the region to continue using Hanford as a nuclear waste disposal site. John Spellman, Washington's new governor-elect, is optimistic that interstate compacts can be in place before the July 1 deadline. But many business people and legislators feel the process could take up to 2 years, leaving out-of-state industries with the option of on-site storage of wastes or a hurried search for new disposal sites. Though there are 2 other commercial low-level nuclear waste sites now in operation, in Barnwell, South Carolina, and Beatty, Nevada, they have cut back on the acceptance of new customers and have, in the past, followed the pattern set by the other operations, refusing to take nuclear waste rejected by another site. Initiative 383 now goes to the State Energy Department for interpretation. It's expected that a number of court challenges may soon follow. For National Public Radio, I'm Barbara Bernhardt in Seattle.
In Richard Nixon's 1968 presidential campaign, a new Republican coalition was outlined in a document, a strategy that put conservatives from the South, Southwest, and West together with blue-collar voters from the Midwest and the Northeast. The campaign blueprint by Kevin Phillips became a book called The Emerging Republican Majority. We asked Phillips if last night's big win for the Republicans was the realization of his hypothesis.
Essentially, but the major caveat I would say is that I don't think at this point, 1980 or the 1980s, we're going to have majority parties or minorities in the old sense, and that the institutional framework is going to have to be somewhat different. I don't think we can have full realignments anymore.
Why not?
Well, probably because politics has been so atomized and fragmented that here you had a big election, but the House of Representatives still did not turn over. The nation's legislature still did not turn over. I don't think it'll be possible to reestablish the party roles, and I would think that what we're likely to see more of will be a somewhat fragmenting party system in which we talk about coalitions that dominate but don't have the full majority status.
Mm-hmm. What kinds of patterns do you see as a result of yesterday's voting?
Well, we've seen since 1960 and 1964 the Republican Party and conservatism, both together in a lot of ways, moving on to a southern and western axis as opposed to an old northeastern establishment axis. People forget that in the days of Herbert Hoover and Franklin D. Roosevelt, conservatism was northeastern and privileged, not Rocky Mountain and southern and populist. And that's clearly taking shape. It has been taking shape for 20 years with the brief interruption of Jimmy Carter's 1976 victory.
And what's the reason for it?
They are essentially an anti-establishment, anti-liberal establishment set of geographical orbits. Establishmentarian liberalism, as defined in the 60s and 70s and now the 80s, is really what's been done under the New Deal extended by Democratic administrations, whether it be foreign policy, domestic, economic, what have you, all of which is in the process of being repudiated by the hinterland, and it's the old populist segments of the country, the anti-establishment areas, that are leading the charge, just as they did against conservative establishments 60 years ago, or for that matter in the 1890s with Bryan. If you want a funny correlation, you correlate the vote for William Jennings Bryan and the vote for Ronald Reagan.
How do you see that correlation?
It's pretty substantial.
Couldn't it be the beginning of a trend, the first step after a good deal of hard work by people like Bill Brock and others, that will start something that's quite different?
I don't think it's the beginning of a new trend. I think what it does is it relates back to 1968 and 1972, and 1976 interrupted that. And what you're seeing is a continuation of it.
As we've said, we have a set of new faces and new lines of influence in the Congress, Republican control in the Senate, a more conservative House of Representatives than ever. But what is the chance for the emergence of coalitions in the Congress, the idea that certain groups can be formed that will cut across geographical and other boundaries?
I think we're going to see a lot of coalitions. I think there's even a chance that you might see a Republican, Conservative, Democratic coalition organize the House of Representatives. They picked up what appears to be 30 seats, which gets them up to low 190s. And if they can cut a deal with roughly 25 Conservative Democrats, they could organize the House. The premium on this might come from the apparent development of a coalition on the cabinet level via Scoop Jackson, and the probability that several Democrats in the Senate will consider crossing to be with a majority now. So I think there's a possibility that things could go a little further than we expect, and that a coalition going beyond the Republican Party could be the key to the 1980s.
Kevin Phillips is author of The Emerging Republican Majority.
NPR, National Public Radio.
WBEZ. 91.5 WBEZ. Penetrating. WBEZ. Chicago.
Good afternoon. At 6:02, the outbound Dan Ryan is heavy in both the local and express lanes from 51st to 93rd, where an accident on the pavement is really tightening things up. The outbound Kennedy is slow between Ohio and North Avenue. Outbound on the Stevenson, it's tight at Damon, again between Kedzie and Pulaski. The outbound Eisenhower is slow at Western, again between Independence and 25th Avenue. Chicago weather, cold and clear tonight with a low around freezing, mostly sunny and warmer tomorrow with a high around 60, partly sunny and mild on Friday with highs in the mid-60s once again. We have 40 degrees right now at O'Hare, 42 at Midway, 45 at the lakefront. This is WBEZ, FM 91.5.
Hello again. It's the third part of All Things Considered. I'm Susan Stamberg.
I'm Sanford Unger. In this half hour, what now?
The effect of the election on the release of the American hostages.
Foreign reaction to the Republican victory.
A Republican Senate means a new majority leader.
Howard Baker, most likely.
Fresh air for the Congress. One analyst examines the air quality.
And the Reagan style of governing.
He delegates and he is flexible.
That word from a Sacramento Observer.
On All Things Considered. First is news from Richard Harris.
Ronald Reagan met with his top advisors today to plan the presidency he'll inherit from Jimmy Carter January 20th. Meantime, Reagan campaign aides explained the whys and wherefores of yesterday's landslide victory to reporters in Los Angeles. NPR's Cokie Roberts reports.
Reagan campaign chief of staff Ed Meese said that the president-elect will not be naming his cabinet until the end of the month, but he's expected to announce the members of his transition team at a news conference tomorrow. The campaign aide said that the former governor's team is hard at work on legislative programs and that Mr. Reagan will be meeting with congressional leaders in the weeks ahead. He hopes to have some sort of legislative calendar in place and a tax proposal ready by the time of his inauguration on January 20th. Aside from those few remarks, today's briefing was mostly devoted to explanations of how the Reagan campaign pulled off such an unexpectedly large win. Pollster Richard Worthland said that the campaign had moved according to schedule, but the support for the Republican nominee grew steadily in the last week before Election Day, with the presidential debate serving as the moment when Ronald Reagan started to move rapidly forward until he achieved yesterday's overwhelming victory. I'm Cokie Roberts in Los Angeles.
Reagan took 51% of the popular vote compared to 41% for Carter, 7% for Anderson. The margin in the Electoral College, however, was overwhelming. 489 votes for Reagan, 49 for the president. Right up until the election, most of the major polls rated the presidential race a toss-up or at least a narrow Reagan victory. So what happened? George Gallup Jr. says the hostages were a factor.
We stopped polling Saturday, so therefore, of course, we couldn't catch any last-minute developments, including those related, of course, to the Iranian situation. It shows again, I think, to the reader that polls are designed to reflect opinion only at a given point in time.
At the White House today, President Carter told reporters he'll devote the closing days of his administration to bringing the hostages home from Iran and helping Mr. Reagan with his transition. Although the president portrayed Reagan as trigger-happy during the campaign, he said today, quote, "I have a firm belief that Governor Reagan will do the utmost to keep the peace." As for his future, Mr. Carter says he just doesn't know. He and Rosalind will talk it over during the next few days. At Camp David, the president says he needs time to be alone and think. And he said it would be a relief to hand over the daily routine to someone else. Carter's campaign manager, Robert Strauss, was asked about the resounding defeat.
Well, I think it's just a confluence of a lot of negative things all came to bear, and I suspect that it looks to us like the hostage thing right at the end just made it shower all down in one big burst.
Strauss also promised to help the president-elect any way he and the administration can. Another Democrat, Massachusetts Senator Edward Kennedy, today pledged his cooperation to help Reagan with national problems, and he said he's sure the Democratic Party will rebuild after yesterday's losses. And those losses were startling. Congress meets again November 12th in a lame duck session that isn't likely to accomplish much. Republicans aren't about to let a Democratic Senate do much when they'll be taking over in 2 months. The shift of power in Congress is astounding. Republicans captured 53 of the 100 Senate seats, and while the Democrats still control the House, the GOP cut into that majority by some 30 seats. Republican control of the Senate also means control of the committee chairs so crucial to legislative proceedings. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina will replace Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts as head of the Senate Judiciary Committee. The new chairman of the Finance Committee will be Bob Dole of Kansas, replacing Louisiana's Russell Long. Other likely changeovers: Tower of Texas as head of Armed Services, Garn of Utah taking over banking, Packwood of Oregon as head of Commerce, and possibly Percy of Illinois to head Foreign Relations, replacing the defeated Frank Church. One Senate race was just decided. A report from Jim Wogan of member station KUAT, Tucson, Arizona.
Incumbent Barry Goldwater has won re-election to the U.S. Senate. The Arizona Republican narrowly survived the greatest challenge of his political career, but voting irregularities delayed a final count. When all absentee votes from one outstanding county were in, final official results showed Goldwater leading slightly by more than 9,000 votes over his Democratic opponent. Some residents of Pima County are still voting, the result of a court ruling after a complaint charged some precincts ran out of ballots last night, forcing some residents away from the polls without voting. County election officials report that only 21 persons have shown up to cast ballots. Officials say those will not be counted until tomorrow and will not change the outcome of any races. For National Public Radio, I'm Jim Wogan in Tucson.
Georgia Senator Herman Talmadge went to bed last night confident of re-election, but this morning his Republican opponent, Mac Mattingly, said he won, and it appears he has by some 11,000 votes. Here's Hal Lamar of member station WABE.
I think the chances of victory are so overwhelming that we can all go home and go to bed, and we'll have a big celebration tomorrow. Thank you.
That was Talmadge at 2 a.m. this morning. He was leading Mattingly with 55% of the vote at that point.
We do claim victory in the senatorial race.
And that was Mattingly at about 11 a.m. Overnight, and with a sizable percentage of the vote from the urban areas of the state counted and reported, the Republican nominee had caught and passed the incumbent Democrat, taking a small but significant lead. Talmadge, meanwhile, has refused to concede, saying he will await the count of absentee votes. But as far as Mattingly is concerned, the race is already over. For National Public Radio, this is Hal Lamar in Atlanta.
Former President Richard Nixon won't be given a role in the Reagan administration. This from Reagan aide James Brady. Nixon said in a recent interview he'd like to be a counselor or negotiator if Reagan was elected. Iran's revolutionary leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, rejected a peace offer from Iraq today and urged his troops to break the Iraqi siege of Abadan, Iran's principal oil refining center. For the first time, Iraq indicates it might expand its territorial claims in the Persian Gulf War and keep vital oil centers it's captured in Iran, but Tehran denies Iraq is in control of those centers. Wall Street seconded Ronald Reagan's smashing triumph with a smashing performance of its own today. Stocks rose at a record pace for most of the session, closing at a near-record volume of 79 million shares. Lee Carr, a securities analyst at New York's Morgan Stanley, says the trendsetters were no surprise.
This spurred a large buy interest of defense stocks, oil-related issues, drilling stocks on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange based on the fact that interest rates would come down, the interest rate structure would come down, and the beneficiaries of these would be obviously some of the stocks that are interest sensitive.
The Dow Jones Industrials closed the session up 16 points. On the New York Exchange, advances led declines 3-1. Volume was so heavy that the tape was an hour behind at one point. That's the news. I'm Richard Harris in Washington.
Back again to those voters in Ames, Iowa, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco. The question this time, what do you think the next 4 Republican years will be like?
Time will tell. Well, that's looking ahead a long way.
Well, I know one man can't do it all.
You know, we'll go completely downhill. Taxes will fly up. You can't buy a house now, but you can completely forget buying a house while he's in office.
I don't think he's very intelligent.
And Reagan is a racist, sexist.
I have no idea, but I don't feel as bad as when Nixon won.
I don't know that he'll last 4 years. I'm anticipating an early impeachment.
Give him a chance anyway.
It might be a change, but I don't think it's going to be any better off.
Very concerned about what the makeup of the Supreme Court will be.
Some kind of change, at least, you know.
People will learn that right-wing solutions are not going to solve the problems of this country.
And it cannot be worse than this.
Well, the way I can see it now is 4 years from now, I can't predict that far, but whatever it is, I think it should be better.
because I don't think either person in the White House at this time can do very much about anything. I don't think it'll make any difference at all.
You go to work again. Well, it's hard to tell. How can anybody tell? It may be worse. Who knows? Well, it might be a change. The liberalism is all done in the United States, I hope.
I think I'll be happy.
I don't know. I don't know. It depends on Congress.
That's a chance we have to take. Ask me in 4 years.
One question that many Americans are asking now is what effect all of this will have on the crisis involving the U.S. hostages in Iran. Barry Rubin is the author of a new book entitled Paved with Good Intentions, The American Experience and Iran. We asked him today what impact Ronald Reagan's victory is likely to have on negotiations to secure the release of those hostages.
Obviously, the first impact of a Reagan election is to postpone a bit the whole thing, any move toward releasing the hostages, because obviously the Carter administration is going to consult with Reagan and his team about any commitments that they're going to make. Secondly of all, in Iran, it's going to stir some confusion because they have so little understanding of the American system. How bound will the next administration be to any agreement they make with this one?
Isn't there a possibility that now Iran will want to speed things up, or at least make more concessions in order to get the hostage crisis resolved while Carter is still president, out of a fear that Ronald Reagan might drive a tougher bargain?
But I should try to make it very clear here that although they sometimes try to play American politics, that American politics are not the most important aspect in the minds of the Iranian leadership right now. Very briefly, the two factors which have turned them around very quickly are the Iran-Iraq war and the pressure it's had on them, and number two, the coming to power of the Islamic Republican Party radical leaders who now have a vested interest in restoring law and order. Now they have the responsibility for governing the country. But I think that the Iranian dilemma was essentially best outlined by the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, Ayatollah Rafsanjani, very close to Ayatollah Khomeini, who made two different statements. He said, we have to speed up the release of the hostages because the Iraq war is not in the interest of Iran and we have to end it. But he also said, how can we deal with this country which has violated us and caused all these problems and dominated us and is the great Satan? Now, this is precisely the problem. How can they explain to their political rivals and the domestic political audience that all of a sudden that they want to make a deal with it and they might even want to make concessions with it? That's a very touchy issue, and for the Iranian leaders, political opinion in Tehran always comes first.
You've written a book about the history of American relations with Iran. How does the election of Ronald Reagan affect this really quite compelling story of the United States and Iran?
The American policy today toward Iran is essentially the same as the American policy since 1946, and that is, since our major concern is the Soviet expansion, and since Iran stands astride the southern border of the USSR, we want a reasonably strong and relatively stable Iran. So I think that will continue to be the essential policy of the American government. On the other hand, we have seen similar kinds of conflicts develop between nations and between various countries in the United States after they have had revolutionary changes, and it often takes an extremely long time to reestablish good political relations. So I think that relations are likely to remain cool for some time. It's very hard to predict, in part because Reagan has two different sets of foreign policy advisors, people who are more ideologically right-wing and people who are more realist types, say, for example, Henry Kissinger. And it's not clear which of these two groups of advisors is going to emerge as the dominant force in the administration.
Barry Rubin is a fellow at the Georgetown University Center for Strategic and International Studies and the author of Paved with Good Intentions, The American Experience and Iran.
The world watches our elections with avid interest, a mixture of fascination and apprehension. Some officials are pleased by the outcome, others upset. Most nations, officially at least, are simply cautious and concerned, waiting to see just how much of Ronald Reagan's campaign rhetoric will end up in President Reagan's administration. The world's governments have been registering their initial reactions. We have a roundup report from NPR's Bill Busenberg.
America's neighbors, Canada and Mexico, have reacted cautiously. Both nations opposed Reagan's vague but often expressed idea for a continental energy accord, and they're concerned about trade and environmental changes under Reagan. The Canadians foresee a period of uncertainty now, but they expect a fairly moderate government in Washington. The Mexicans have already issued a warning to the new American administration: don't intervene in Central America or try to solve problems there superficially with repression. In Europe, the public response, especially in Britain, has been positive. Margaret Thatcher sent a warm message to her new conservative counterpart. The French foresee an end to the period of uncertainty in the United States, and Chancellor Helmut Schmidt was quoted as saying, "A Reagan administration with Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, and Alexander Haig may not be that bad after all." But on specifics, there are disagreements. America's allies in Europe favor the SALT process and some degree of détente with the Soviets, and they don't want to be pushed into spending more on arms for NATO. The Soviet Union does not seem to be entirely displeased by what one commentator called Carter's political fiasco. To the Kremlin, Carter was too unpredictable. The first reaction from Moscow radio was that Carter lost because of the U.S. economy and his hostility toward the Soviet Union. The Soviets noted Reagan's opposition to the grain embargo. The Kremlin is also pleased that Reagan is not overly popular with the Chinese. The Chinese blamed Carter's loss on the growing threat of Soviet expansionism overseas. China also wants the current U.S.-Chinese relationship to continue and warned the president-elect again that Taiwan was an internal Chinese matter. Privately, one Chinese official was quoted as saying that Reagan and Mao's widow, the discredited Chiang Ching, are excellent examples of why actors should stay out of politics. Meanwhile, in Taiwan, there were firecrackers in the streets, celebrating Reagan's victory with what the nationalist Chinese believe will mean closer ties between Taiwan and the United States. Elsewhere in Asia, South Korea and the Philippines were also pleased, while in Japan there was apprehension based on trade considerations. The Japanese hope Reagan's vow to cut imports from Japan will soften once he's in power. In Africa, the South African government is very pleased with Reagan's victory, while newly independent Zimbabwe is worried. Prime Minister Robert Mugabe cabled Reagan saying he hoped the current good relations between the two countries would continue. In Latin America, military governments were optimistic that Reagan's election will lead to a reduction in tensions with Washington over human rights. For example, an Argentine official told me today that with Reagan and the change in the U.S. Senate, Argentina looks forward to a lifting of the U.S. embargo on arms, military training, and internationally financed projects. On the other hand, Cuba, which tried to help Carter by avoiding problems with the U.S., and Nicaragua are upset by Reagan's victory. They anticipate that Reagan's campaign rhetoric may lead to military intervention in countries like El Salvador. In the Middle East, Israel seems satisfied with the conservative shift in Washington, foreseeing firmer support. Egypt said Reagan's victory will bolster U.S. strength in the Middle East, but will mean a postponement of a January summit meeting. The only universal reaction to yesterday's American election I found is spelled R-E-L-I-E-F. Relief that the campaign is finally over. I'm Bill Busenberg in Washington.
In the fell clutch of circumstance, we have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, our head is bloody but unbowed.
Senator Robert Byrd speaking, reciting really, for reporters in Washington today. The West Virginia Democrat went to bed last night as the powerful Senate Majority Leader. He woke up this morning to learn that he will be relieved of those duties in January, when Republicans take control of the Senate. NPR's Clem Taylor reports.
One who had just witnessed the sound thrashing of his beloved Democratic Party, a man who bristles at the mere mention of television cameras, Robert Byrd was remarkably upbeat as he faced scores of reporters in the wood-paneled Mike Mansfield room of the Capitol. He congratulated the Republicans on their victory yesterday, endorsed speculation that the next Congress will be a more conservative one, and promised that the Democratic minority would not roll over and play dead.
We will cooperate with Mr. Reagan and with the Republican leadership in the Senate in keeping the legislative process moving and in moving the programs wherever we can. If we differ, we will try to be constructive and responsible.
Byrd will have served 4 years as Majority Leader. He brushed aside rumors that Senator Edward Kennedy might challenge him for the post of Minority Leader. Of Kennedy, Byrd said, "I have no closer friend in the United States Senate." Byrd was followed into the Mansfield room by Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee, the minority leader. Conservatives who still resent Baker's support of the Panama Canal treaties would rather see one of their own as the new majority leader. Baker says he expects to disappoint them.
I intend to be the majority leader of the United States Senate. I harbor no ill will against any person or any group. The conservative movement in the United States contributed significantly to Ronald Reagan's victory, but so do those who were not so conservative.
Baker says he has the votes to win the majority leader's post in the Republican caucus and said his name will be placed in nomination by Nevada Senator Paul Laxalt, who many thought might challenge him for the leadership. During his tenure as minority leader, Howard Baker has often been heard complaining about Majority Leader Byrd's effective use of Senate rules and parliamentary procedure. But with a Republican majority in the Senate come January, Baker is having second thoughts.
A lot of the rules that I used to protest about to Robert Byrd look a lot more attractive now than they
Senate Minority Leader Howard Baker. I'm Clem Taylor on Capitol Hill.
The changing of the guard that we're beginning to see in the Senate may seem startling to us now, but it's happened before, of course, many times. The last time was in the 1950s, though. Norman Ornstein, professor of political science at Catholic University, points out that these changes may take a lot more preparation before the new majority sets its course and gets down to the business of tackling the work of the new administration.
Well, in a way, what we have is a change that brings us back to the period of the early 50s. 1958 changed us from an era of a decade or more before where we had really close party competition. The Senate majority-minority decided by one vote or one seat for 6 straight years. And basically, in the early 50s. Basically, at the time that Wayne Morse, the senator from Oregon, switched from being a Republican to an independent and then to a Democrat, that caused the Senate party control to shift. 58 broke the back of that close party control and gave us an era, really from then until now, of pretty comfortable Democratic margins.
Now, are there parallels in terms of how the Republicans handled their control of the Senate when they were elected in 52 and the way they might handle that now?
I would guess not. For one thing, while there had been, the Democrats had basically dominated the Senate from 1932 until 1952, there had been at least one election earlier, the 1946 election, when the Republicans had control. And what that meant was that in 1952, when they regained control, after 6 years in the wasteland, there were a number of people in the Senate who had been chairman, who knew what it was like. Now you've got an extraordinary situation. You haven't had Republican control of either House of Congress in 26 years. You haven't got anybody in the Senate, Republican in the Senate, who's ever been a chairman, who knows what it's like. So I don't think the parallels are all that great. I think in many ways the Republicans are going to be groping to decide what they're going to do. And you have, for example, liberal Mark Hatfield scheduled to take over the powerful Appropriations Committee, and moderate to liberal Chuck Percy scheduled to take over the Foreign Relations Committee. Many of the conservatives and the staunch conservatives in the Senate who are Republicans are not going to be too anxious to see that.
The Senate has this reputation as the world's greatest deliberative body, and we've all sort of gone through school thinking of the Senate as a place where great men, more recently perhaps a few great women, have deliberated on issues of national importance. Is to the extent that one can make a judgment like this, I mean, I've heard people say that whatever happened to the great Senate, whatever happened to those marvelous debates that used to go on even in the post-war period, is this a greater Senate or a lesser Senate that the country seems to be getting in January?
My own judgment is that it's a lesser Senate, not because of the ideological shift, not because of the party shift, but I look at some of the people who've been elected in the last 4 to 6 years, Democrats and Republicans, and I see an ocean of mediocrity. There are a lot of the more thoughtful and more dedicated legislators, the people who really have had a dedication to the process and to getting good public policy through, are gone. And while there are still some very impressive people remaining, the weight in the institution, I think, is leaning towards mediocrity. And that's a very disturbing thing, and I think we're going to have to pay as much attention in the next few years to the process by which we recruit candidates to the House and Senate as we do to the process by which we recruit people to the presidency.
Norman Ornstein is professor of political science at Catholic University and a leading student of the House and the Senate. We'll talk to him tomorrow about the House.
We can't really know how Ronald Reagan is going to govern as president, but there may be some hints, some clues from his record as governor of California. Ed Salzman is editor of the California Journal, and he's a seasoned observer of the political scene in Ronald Reagan's home state.
As governor, Reagan sat as sort of an overseer of an operation that was run quite smoothly by Ed Meese, who was his chief of staff and will be undoubtedly the chief of staff in Washington. Reagan himself did not get very deeply involved in the details of government. He left that delegated to others from Meese on down. And the caliber of government in Reagan's administration depended quite heavily on the caliber of people that he selected to be responsible for different areas. He got quite a bit of notoriety because when issues would come to him, they used what's known as the mini-memo technique, where the subject matter would be analyzed, pros and cons, recommendations, and then theoretically based on that, Reagan would make decisions. He did use a cabinet system where the cabinet would sit around and actually vote and advise and hash out issues.
And how much part did he take in those sorts of discussions, or did he sit back and listen?
He is a listener. He is not a hothead. He's not the kind of an impulsive person in making governmental decisions.
How does he feel about controversy? Were people able to look him in the eye in that cabinet and say, you're wrong?
It depended on the individuals. Ed Meese, the chief of staff, is going to be very, very important. He is a fellow who does not have a huge ego that he has to fill. He is the ultimate staff person, has an experience in government. He's not anti-government. And the recommendations by Ed Meese to Ronald Reagan will be very, very important, as they were during the campaign.
I started out by asking you about Ronald Reagan, and almost every answer you gave me had the name Ed Meese. How come?
Well, Ed Meese is the person in this Reagan operation that both Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan trust implicitly. And in terms of handling the details of government, Ed Meese will be the president. In terms of making the final decisions, of course, Ronald Reagan will be the president.
How wide a circle was there from which these advisors would be drawn?
You might think that Reagan's staffers and advisors and appointees would come almost exclusively from the right wing of the Republican Party. That was not the case. They ranged the full spectrum. But Reagan has been working in this campaign with a great many Californians. As a team, he never really dismantled the group of insiders who worked with him for 8 years in Sacramento. I think the big exception will probably be foreign affairs. Of course, there wasn't any Department of State in the Reagan administration in California.
But to what extent is he a loyalist to that circle? To what extent might he be willing to step outside it, to go to the experienced, seasoned observers in other areas?
I'll say one thing for Reagan. The man is flexible. If somebody comes to him with a practical problem, he'll find a practical solution.
Ed Salzman, editor of the California Journal in Sacramento.
This is Robert Covington at the White House. The president left for Camp David. I have ambience of the event, and there were about 200 or 300 staffers on the South Lawn to see him off. Labor Secretary Marshall, Secretary Muskie, Charles Schultz of the Council of Economic Advisors, Warren Christopher, Deputy Secretary of State, Robert Lipschultz, campaign treasurer in 1976, and President
And for this evening, that's all things considered.
We had help from these public radio stations tonight: WGBH Boston, WSSR Springfield, Illinois, KOAP Portland, Oregon,
WABE Atlanta, WDET Detroit, KUAT Tucson, and WOI Ames, Iowa.
And KLCC Eugene, Oregon, KUOW Seattle, and KQED San Francisco.
Chris Koch is our executive producer, Maury Schlesinger our producer, and Ted Clark our editor. Gary Cavino and technicians Lorraine Wilcox and Jude Franco.
And the other spirits that move us are Deirdre Berger, Cotty Simon, Nina Ellis, Lily Franklin, Bob Wisdom, Alex Van Ost, D. Clark Wells, and Betty Rogers.
Funds from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I'm Sanford Unger.
I'm Susan Stamberg. Happy Halloween weekend from All Things Considered.
Oh, come on now. What do you expect? I mean, I really am in the cemetery. It really is midnight. I really am yelling out her name in a spooky kind of way. And I'm all alone. And it really is kind of a documentary kind of thing. But you didn't expect to get a ghost here, did you?
This is NPR, National Public Radio.